Hi, I'm John Mulford, the Director of the Center for Entrepreneurship at Regent University, and it's my pleasure today to welcome an old friend and former student, Dale Fenwick. Dale, thanks for being here.
Good to see you again, John.
And Dale's going to be talking about risk management and risk financing. But before we get into that, I just wanted to get a little bit of your background, have you just sort of fill us in on what happened since graduation that led you into this field and give us a sense of what you do, so we'll be able to see how it relates.
Sure. Actually, let me back up before my experience at Regent. My undergraduate degree is in mining engineering, and so I have that setting. Now, I actually got involved in risk management in the mining business. I worked in that for about 12 years before coming to Regent, but I didn't know it was risk management at the time because we didn't use those terms. But just like everything else, God used those experiences, okay, and then the education I gained at Regent to help me move into a whole nother field. So after leaving Regent, I did some consulting work and went to work for one of my clients who was in the risk management business and worked for them for several years. And then in about, I guess it was 2000, I actually started off on my own and doing risk management consulting, primarily in the risk financing section of that, and we'll probably talk about the details of it. But essentially, I tell people that I'm a risk financing consultant. That's my answer to that question on an airplane, in an elevator, at dinner, or at a cocktail party or something like that. When people hear that, they generally, half the people who hear, if it's a social setting and they're not sitting down, they will move away. Because they say, alternative risk financing consultant, oh, that sounds like you're going to try to sell me insurance or some kind of thing. People who stay actually will ask the question, what kind of insurance do I sell? And my answer to that is, actually, if I do my job right, my clients buy less insurance. Now, this intrigues people because, frankly, people don't like buying insurance. And by the way, after they buy it, they don't want to use it. It generally means something bad has happened. So I answer the question, how do you buy less insurance? I said, it's really easy. You just have to be willing to take more risk. Those people at that point will generally then go join the people who left at the first of that. But no, essentially what I do is I help business owners buy less insurance by looking at their history of claims and losses and their exposures. And we'll get into some of the details, I think, as we talk about what all those terms mean.
Right.
And help them figure out, okay, am I wasting money on buying insurance on the low end? Now, when I say buy less insurance, I do not mean buy less insurance in terms of upper limit protection, okay? I'm talking about where buying insurance for things that you're pretty sure is going to happen. And again, based upon history, I know, and I've used this personal example before. I know that my wife and I are going to spend between $1,800 and $2,200 a year on healthcare expenses because I've tracked it, okay? And so I've always bought a $2,500 high deductible policy. It just made sense. I mean, if I know I'm going to spend on average, let's say $2,000 a year, the insurance company knows that. Now here's the thing. You give money to the insurance company that they know they're going to spend on your claims, they're going to add to that their administrative costs and their profit cost. They're going to add 20 to 30+%. And so it's much cheaper just to self-insure when you know it's going to happen. So that's what I do. Obviously, I've used a small example there, but I work with all the different types of companies, industrial companies, healthcare companies of a certain size where we can have some predictability of their losses, and then we can structure a self-insurance program that allows them to ultimately save money.
Okay. Well, let's try to get our mind around this whole concept of risk.
Okay.
I mean, risk sounds like something you don't want, because it sounds like a bad thing. When you're thinking about business risk, I mean, how do you think about that and structure it as you're talking eventually about buying insurance?
Well, you're right. The only way I know of to avoid risk is to do nothing, because everything you do in the morning. I mean, I got up this morning and I'm staying in a hotel room. And it was interesting. I had a decision to make. Do I put the bath mat in the tub before I take the shower? Or do I not? Okay. Do I take the risk that this bathtub that I've never been in before is slick or not? Well, the bath mat's there for a reason. And I actually thought about this. If I ran a hotel, I would tell my housekeeping people, when you clean the room, put the bath mat back in the tub. okay? Put it in place. Don't, and therefore force people to actually remove the bath mat.
Mm-hmm.
And then if they slip and fall, they took additional risk in that particular case.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't avoid risk. You have to decide what you're going to do about risk. Now, we say, on one hand, we say we can't avoid risk, although ironically, that is one of the first techniques that we use when dealing with risk is this something we can avoid? And it could be, for example, in your business, you have a choice of using hazardous chemicals or not. And you say, well, okay, I don't want to do that, and so I'm going to avoid using those chemicals. I've got a client who's in the metal recycling business. On their website, they have a long list of things that they do not accept. And it all has to do with hazardous materials and things like that.
Right.
So they're avoiding the risk of a pollution problem by not accepting those materials. You've got to take those materials someplace else. It's the whole idea. And they train their employees to check when they go to the customer site to pick things up to make sure that the things they don't want are in there. So that's one way to deal with risk is avoid risk.
Right. So let's say you want to do this thing that's going to have some risk. Can you mitigate or reduce your risk by the way you do the process or the activity?
You know, that's another step in dealing with risk is to control the risk, which usually means minimizing that risk. And probably best examples there were in the place of, say, workplace safety. You've got employees working in a hazardous area in healthcare, for example, where there might be infectious diseases. Okay, if you're going to be in healthcare, certain types of it, you're going to expose employees to these. How do you minimize that risk? Well, you minimize the risk by, number one, training the employees properly, and number two, providing them with the proper personal protective equipment, or PPE, that will keep them from being exposed to those hazards. So that's an example of how to control risk that you can't avoid because it's just inherent into your business.
So then you're still left with some risk, which is uncertain. So what do you do with that?
Okay, so if you've done what you can to avoid and you've done what you can to control risk, now the issue is, okay, what about what I can't? Then you have to either transfer that risk to someone else or end up financing that risk, or finally the default position is you have to retain that risk and just accept it. Now, the transfer risk piece, let me continue with my healthcare analogy. If you're a hospital, one way to transfer that risk of exposing your employees to hazardous microbes or germs is to contract with someone else and have their employees come in and do the work. And therefore, you've done a contractual transfer of that risk to someone else. The risk is still there, but it's not your risk anymore. It's now someone else's.
Why would someone want to do that? Why would they want to take on the risk?
Well, they might want to take on the risk because they're trained for it, okay, and they're specialists in it. Probably a better example in this would be when it comes to asbestos. You know, people are remodeling a building or a house, and they all of a sudden realize, oh, wait a minute, there might be asbestos here. So they have someone come in and inspect, and if they find asbestos, they will then generally contract with someone else to come in and remove the asbestos. Now, in doing that, they've transferred actually two areas of risk. The first one is exposure of their employees. These people are trained, they know how to do it right and minimize the exposure. And frankly, if their employees do get exposed to it, then they're going to have to deal with those issues. The other thing that you gain on the asbestos one is you've now transferred the regulatory risk of properly disposing of those hazardous materials. So you get both of those in that example.
Okay, so you can transfer to someone who's better equipped to deal with it.
Right. In the end, you've got risks that you can't minimize any further than they are. You can't transfer to anyone else, and so you're going to have to retain those risks. That's when you get into really my area of specialty, which is risk financing. Risk financing is figuring out where am I going to get the money to pay for something bad that happens, okay? That I don't really want to happen, but I have to acknowledge could happen. Okay, how am I going to finance that? How am I going to pay for it? And for most people, the knee-jerk reaction to that and the default position is, well, let's buy insurance for that.
Right.
And that's what most people do. But let me add one more thing. There is another alternative. on our list in the menu, which is borrowing money. Now, this is a dangerous risk financing method because most lenders don't want to lend you money when you need it the worst. So if you have a restaurant, for example, and it burns down and you didn't have property insurance and you go to the bank to borrow money, the bank's going to say, well, how am I going to get paid back? Okay, so, but as an example, state of Florida, where I live, in 2008, went out and actually purchased a line of credit from Berkshire Hathaway, paid $250 million for an $8 billion line of credit. Essentially, Berkshire Hathaway promised, in exchange for $250 million, to purchase $8 billion in bonds from the state of Florida at a pre-agreed to interest rate, I think it was 6.5% then, and a pre-agreed to term, 30 years. They did this in advance because they were worried that if there was another catastrophic storm season like we had in 2004, it would wipe out the catastrophic fund in Florida, and they would not have it. They needed to have access to more money. So they actually prearranged a borrowing. It's kind of like a line of credit. Okay, it's an unusual strategy for, and most people aren't in a position to do it.
Yeah.
For most people, risk financing means buying insurance.
Okay. So how do you decide how much to buy and how much to retain the risk yourself? Or is that something we're going to get into when we get into the details?
We're going to get into that a little bit, but in essence, this is the other thing that people have to think about, especially if it's a startup type of business. Okay, how we handle our personal insurance is different than commercial insurance. Okay, there's some significant differences, and especially in terms of how deductibles are handled, for example. But essentially, you should not buy, and this is what my clients that I work with, I tell them is, let's not buy insurance on something we know is going to happen. Let's budget for that. That's what we should be doing. We should be budgeting for things that we expect are going to happen. And in fact, many larger companies and even medium-sized companies do this already. I'm working with a client who has a fleet of 120 trucks and trailers. They have $200,000 to $300,000 a year in damage that happens to those vehicles. Now, not liability for when they may run into someone else. This is simply damage to their vehicles that they're responsible for. They actually carry no physical damage coverage at all. They're totally self-insured for that.
So
they've decided to retain that because they can predict it.
Right. So when you said you know it's going to happen, you mean you can predict it within a pretty close range based on your experience?
Correct. That's it. When you say you know, it's like obviously it's not total certainty, but it's a matter of based upon history, I can reasonably predict that I'm going to get this amount of cost in that particular area. And whenever you do those sort of statistical analysis, there's going to be some percentage of error, some volatility, and I'm willing to accept that percentage, understanding that, okay, on average the cost is $100,000, but I know that it could easily vary between $70,000 and $130,000. You say, okay, I'll accept that level of volatility, because in the long run, self-insurance really is the cheapest. Because yes, on average it could be 100, but from time to time you're going to have good years and you're going to have bad years.
But if that volatility range is too large, could you then insure over a certain amount because you don't want to budget that amount?
And that really is the right strategy, is to say, okay, I'm willing to accept a certain amount of risk and volatility, but if it's a really bad year, I want to purchase what we call excess insurance above that, so that I'm self-insured for what I reasonably expect to happen, but I bought insurance for what I don't think is going to happen, but if it does, I want to be covered for that, mainly because it's going to protect my balance sheet. I can afford a bad year, but I can't afford a really bad year.
How does that differ from buying insurance with that level of deductible? In other words, if it was $130,000, you didn't want to go above that, could you buy an insurance policy with a $130,000 deductible, or would that be different from buying excess insurance?
No, they're actually the same.
Okay.
In fact, in my world, I like to use the word retain as a concept. I mean, it's actually in the insurance world, it's also a product. There's a difference between a deductible policy and a retention policy, and we'll probably get into that. But retention as a concept says, I have decided to retain this risk. In other words, not get outside financing for it. I'm going to pay for it out of my operating funds. Okay. And whether it's through a deductible product with a carrier or if it's self-insurance with excess coverage, it's really the same economic result in the end.
Okay, so I think we've got a pretty good summary and introduction to
Okay.
the whole field.